Welcome to this explainer on the International Criminal Court. Today, we're exploring a fascinating and incredibly high-stakes tension, the gap between the ambitious, world-changing promises of the ICC to end global impunity and the complex, deeply challenging, and often gritty reality of how international justice actually plays out. We're looking at a system designed to hold the world's absolute worst offenders accountable. But, as you're going to see, turning that noble idea into legal practice, well, it's anything but simple.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the road to Rome, break down the four core crimes, discuss the court of last resort mechanism, look at the ICC in action, and finally, wrap up with criticisms and challenges.
Part 1. The Road to Rome, from impunity to international justice.
To really get the ICC today, we've got to look back at the desperate historical need for a permanent international tribunal. For decades, the world was literally just relying on temporary courts built after the damage was already done. The international community slowly started moving away from the post-World War II victor's justice at Nuremberg and Tokyo back in 1945. But honestly, it wasn't until the horrors in Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the early 90s that everyone finally realized, okay, creating these temporary ad hoc courts is just way too slow and politically exhausting. And that realization is exactly what catalyzed the monumental 1998 conference, giving us the Rome Statute and officially creating the permanent ICC in 2002.
But getting there? It was a massive diplomatic battle. Even though an overwhelming 120 nations voted in favor of the Rome Statute, establishing this incredibly ambitious permanent court faced some heavy, immediate pushback from major global powers. We're talking about the United States and China, who ultimately actually voted against it. But despite that resistance, the treaty entered into force anyway, marking a pretty fundamental shift in international law.
Moving on to Part 2, the four core crimes, defining atrocities. So, what are the actual rules of the game here? The court's jurisdiction essentially covers what we can call the big four crimes. We've got genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and those were locked in right from the very start. And then there's the crime of aggression. Now, this one was a much later, highly complex addition that actually didn't come into force until 2018, and it's what allows the court to prosecute leaders for the illegal use of armed force against another state. Let's talk about genocide, often called the crime of crimes. Prosecuting this at the ICC is incredibly difficult. Why? Because it requires proving what the law calls dual intent. So you don't just have to prove that someone committed mass murder, that's the general criminal intent, you also have to prove their specific intent was to destroy a particular national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Trying to prove exactly what was going on inside a leader's head to that exact specification, that is a massive legal hurdle. And this brilliantly illustrates the difference between these core crimes. So unlike genocide, crimes against humanity do not require the prosecutor to prove the target was a specific discriminatory group. Instead, the focus shifts entirely to scale and organization. It applies to any civilian population as long as the acts are part of a widespread or systematic attack. It's a crucial distinction. Part 3. Court of Last Resort, the gatekeeper mechanism. Now that we know the crimes, we really need to understand exactly when the ICC is actually allowed to step in. Because listen, the ICC is not some global police force. The crucial concept to grasp here is the principle of complementarity. The ICC is fundamentally designed as a court of last resort. So the primary responsibility to investigate and prosecute these atrocities always rests with sovereign national jurisdictions. The ICC only gets the green light to intervene if a nation is genuinely unwilling or unable to carry out the investigation themselves. To ground all this dense legal framework in real human stakes, just consider this number: 13,000. That's the number of victims who actively participated in ICC proceedings just between 2021 and 2022 alone. It's huge. The Rome Statute actually created mechanisms that allow victims to present evidence and even claim reparations, finally giving a voice to those directly devastated by these crimes.
All right, Part 4, the ICC in action, expectations versus reality. Moving from the theory to the practice, it's time for a bit of a reality check. When you think about the massive scale of global atrocities over the last 20 years, and then consider the breakdown of the 49 total defendants, it's striking. Just 10 successful convictions, 4 acquittals. The rest? They're either ongoing or the cases were closed because the accused died or proceedings were terminated. It's a highly concentrated, very limited reality compared to what the world initially expected.
So why are those numbers so incredibly low? Well, because the gears of international justice turn agonizingly slowly. I mean, just moving from a preliminary examination to a full investigation to actually arresting a suspect
conducting the trial, and then surviving an appeal. It's an enormously complex endeavor. We're talking about a process that routinely takes a decade or more to complete for just a single defendant.
But it's important to note there have been some massive milestones within that grinding process. For instance, 30 years. That number represents the 30-year sentence handed down to Congolese militia leader Bosco Ntaganda. Not only is this literally the longest sentence in the court's history, but the case was an absolutely massive victory for international law. It firmly established sexual violence committed against a commander's own troops, which tragically included child soldiers, as a recognized war crime.
However, the prosecution has definitely faced some devastating setbacks too. High-profile cases, like those of former Central African Republic Vice President Jean-Pierre Bemba and former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo, ended in stunning acquittals. Bemba's conviction was famously overturned on appeal. Legal experts have pointed out that these reversals completely upended established court procedures. And as you can imagine, it caused immense frustration for the thousands of victims who had literally waited years for justice.
And that brings us to Part 5, Criticisms and Challenges. A court at a crossroads. Following an independent expert review commissioned by the Assembly of States Parties, the ICC is currently facing a wave of totally valid structural and political criticisms. A recent quote directly from the current ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, perfectly encapsulates the intense internal frustration and the really fierce external critiques the court is dealing with today. A massive financial and diplomatic investment has been made, but the courtroom results, they simply haven't matched those soaring expectations. That independent review detailed some severe systemic challenges. Internally, experts noted inconsistent procedural practices and a lack of collegiality among judges that basically just drag these trials out. Externally, the court is seriously hamstrung by state non-cooperation. For example, multiple states simply refused to arrest former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir when he visited their territories. No arrest, no trial. Furthermore, the court faces severe political pushback, notably from the United States, which at one point actually went as far as imposing economic sanctions on the ICC's top prosecutor.
And that leaves us with this final, truly vital question. We've seen the brilliant architectural promise of the Rome Statute, and we've seen the harsh, incredibly slow-moving reality of its practice. So, after 2 decades of operation, can the ICC actually overcome its internal friction and external political limits to evolve into the ultimate deterrent against global atrocities? Or will the structural realities of international sovereignty basically always keep its loftiest goals just out of reach? It's a critical question for the future of international justice. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we really hope this journey has empowered you with a clearer, deeper understanding of the International Criminal Court.